The following is a special Encore presentation of a Blue Sky episode that originally dropped in May of 2023. From the studios of the Optimism Institute, welcome to Blue Sky, where we share stories and insights to remind us that there is always blue sky above. Sometimes you just have to get your head above the clouds to see it. I'm your host, Bill Burke. In today's episode of Blue Sky, we're going to take a look at global development and consider whether we should be optimistic about the progress being made around the globe on issues like poverty, overall standards of living, war and peace, tolerance, and more. To offer his take on all of this will be my guest, Charles Kenny. Charles is a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development, a Washington, D.C.-based think tank that works to reduce global poverty and improve lives through innovative economic research that drives better policy and practice. His current work focuses on global economic prospects, gender and development finance. He's the author of several books, including two that I read and really enjoyed: Getting Better, Why Global Development is Succeeding, and The Upside of Down, Why the Rise of the Rest is Good for the West. He's been a contributing editor at Foreign Policy magazine and a regular contributor to Business Week. Charles was previously at the World Bank, where he worked on governance and anti-corruption in infrastructure and natural resources, and managed a number of investment and technical assistant projects. As you're about to hear, Charles is a really smart guy with interesting takes on a wide range of issues. And I hope you enjoy our conversation. I know I did. Charles Kenny, welcome to the Blue Sky Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Charles, you're a member of the Center for Global Development, a think tank, and I have always wanted to be part of a think tank. Unfortunately, nobody seems to want my brand of thinking in their tank. But could you tell us what that's all about? What do you all do at the Center for Global Development?
We are interested in the policies and actions of rich countries that affect developing countries. So we're interested in trade and migration and investment and aid flows and so on. And we're interested in the direct actions, sort of, the United States trading with Uganda, as it might be, but also how they work through international institutions like the World Bank or the IMF or the World Health Organization.
And your personal point of view, I don't know if it's shared by the entire group, though, is that Americans who get discouraged about development overseas are kind of missing the point, because we tend to emphasize things like GDP or the wealth, quote unquote, wealth of a country, and we don't think about more important measures. Can you describe that to me and your point of view on this and what so many people here are missing?
Sure. I think there is an idea in rich countries, not just the US, that the developing world is doing really badly. If you look at poll evidence, people tend to suggest poverty is going up and that child mortality is going up and that things, are as bad or worse than they've ever been. And the evidence is the complete opposite. I don't think income is a be-all and end-all measure, but if you want to look for a minute at global poverty numbers, which is defined as $2.15 a day, it's a very low, extreme poverty number. But 50, 60 years ago, about 80% of the world lived at that kind of level, below that kind of level of income, and now we're down to sort of 10%. I think more importantly, if you look at measures like child mortality, the number of kids dying before the age of 5, we've just revolutionized the way the world looks in terms of that indicator. So it used to be worldwide, if you were a parent, you'd expect one of your children to die before the age of 5. Worldwide, that is now a really rare event. We just in the past 20 years, we've cut the child mortality rate by 2/3. And if you want one single measure of global progress, of human progress, I don't think there's a better one than the fact that it used to be a regular event that parents were burying their child. And now, even in the poorest countries in the world, it's a comparatively rare tragedy. It's not rare enough. There are still many children dying of easily preventable diseases. But compared to where we were, 30 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, it's just a revolutionary, awesome change.
And what has driven that change?
That change in particular, a whole bunch of really cheap and absolutely fantastic technologies, frankly. Vaccinations. Loads of kids worldwide used to die from measles. Measles deaths have gone down by about 90%, I think. A whole range of other childhood diseases have been almost wiped out. Polio almost wiped out, for example. Smallpox, something that killed about 100 million people in the 20th century, has so far this century, touch wood, killed no one because we wiped it out worldwide. But not just vaccines, also antibiotics, another complete miracle drug that can turn cases of diarrhea that used to kill people now don't, because you give them antibiotics and they don't die. Another thing that diarrhea is a massive global killer still, but another thing that's really reduced the death rate hugely is just the figuring out that the combination of salt and water and sugar, if you feed that to kids who have diarrhea, they will not die from dehydration. So a whole bunch of really sort of simple to use technologies have been a huge force behind this. But I'll also say it's about parents, getting access to these technologies, using these technologies. It's about governments providing these services on top of clean water and other health services and so on. It's about the global community supporting that through aid and investment. So it's not. It hasn't been easy. I don't mean to claim it's been easy, but it has been revolutionary, and it has reached worldwide in a way that's just had this hugely positive and dramatic impact.
And for some reason, we just don't properly appreciate it, it feels to me. And I know that's a lot of your work. And even in this country, you mentioned antibiotics, one of my favorite anecdotes. It's a sad one, but when Calvin Coolidge was a sitting president of the United States, his son died from an infected blister playing tennis. Antibiotics would have saved him on a quick visit. That was not that long ago, 100 years ago.
Yeah, or an example I use in the book I've written for children on this is if you look at the sort of formal portrait of Louis XIV's family, this is the Sun King, richest guy in France, probably at least one of the 2 or 3 richest people in the world at the time, right? Built Versailles, fantastic palace, hundreds of rooms, beautiful gardens, all sorts of stuff. You look at the family portrait, you kind of go through the members of the family, and there are 2 kids who in the portrait actually appear as being in a little portrait of themselves, and that's because they died before the family portrait could be painted. So they died as kids from an easily preventable set of conditions. There are 2 more kids who died from easily preventable conditions. The king and his wife both died of things that can be cured by antibiotics. This whole family, richest family in France. And all of them are dropping dead from things that would be a minor inconvenience today. And it just sort of shows you how much progress we've made.
And you've written several books, and you just referenced a children's book, which I've not seen, but I've read Getting Better and The Upside of Down. I've loved them both. And in addition to sort of global health measures, life expectancy, child mortality, you also talk about technologies just improving standard of living and cost of living. Can you give some examples of that? Again, things that we tend to take for granted. So in a developing country where perhaps the GDP isn't growing as fast as we'd like, or the wealth of that country, but the standard of living and the cost of living has improved dramatically. Can you give some examples of that?
And one of the ones that's been fairly revolutionary is the mobile phone. That worldwide 2 or 3 decades ago, most people worldwide never made a phone call. And now, even in the poorest countries, 2/3 of people have at least access to a mobile phone. And that's kind of revolutionary, because something else that's changed over the last 100 years is the amount that people move. It used to be moving was massively expensive. You'd have to spend a month's worth of income in order to travel between cities, just because it took a hugely long time and the roads were terrible, and it was a really expensive endeavor. Transport is so much more efficient that even in very poor countries, people travel a lot. And that means parents are away from children, they're away from their own parents, children are away from parents and so on. And so keeping in touch with a mobile phone is a really important part of keeping families and friends together now in a way that it wasn't 200 years ago, because everybody stayed in the same place. But on top of that, the mobile phone is being used for all sorts of things, far more than in the United States. Even in countries like Kenya, we're seeing people use the mobile phone for financial transactions. They use it as their bank, their bank account, for example. And so thousands of people who didn't have access to a bank account and were keeping their cash under the pillow, if you will, have now got access to sort of modern banking services. And so this one little technology has had this huge impact. And you can see it actually in the GDP statistics even. A lot of it you can't see in the standard income statistics. But the mobile phone has had such a big impact that countries are realizing they have to sort of rebase their GDP. They have to refigure out how big their economy is, because the mobile phone has got so big so fast that they're undercounting its effect in the economy. And Nigeria's economy, when they sort of realized, oops, we're not measuring the impact of the mobile phone, went up by 20% in size overnight. I mean, it didn't really go up by 20% overnight, obviously. The measurement went up by 20%, but that's how much of an impact the mobile phone's been having on the economy. And as I say, I think its effects go way beyond that, keeping families together in contact, able to support each other far more easily. And there are a whole bunch of really simple technologies like that. Plastic sheeting is another one. Plastic buckets. Clothing, the cost of clothing has dropped hugely dramatically. The cost of lighting, there's a wonderful paper by William Nordhaus, who is a Nobel Prize winning economist. He actually went out, bought himself a replica Roman oil lamp, bought himself a whole bunch of olive oil, burnt the oil in the lamp, saw how much light that created and how much he paid for the oil and all that. Did the same thing with an early filament light bulb, from the 1900s, did the same thing with LEDs and so on and so forth. Anyway, he worked out that the price of light, so what you pay in terms of light bulb and electricity or lamp and oil, the price of light over the past sort of 1,000 years has gone down by way over 1,000-fold, right? So it used to be that light was the privilege of the very rich who would have a candle next to their bedside, right? That was privilege. Having one candle next to your bedside at night. Now, even the poorest families in some of the poorest parts of the world have multiple light sources way more powerful than the candle, and they're paying way less for it. So there are, all sorts of technologies that just had a revolutionary effect, not just in the rich world, but worldwide.
Okay, first off, did you hear how deftly Charles dodged my obvious plea for getting invited to a think tank? I told you he was smart. But in addition to his intellect, one of the things I find so compelling about Charles is the enthusiasm with which he delivers this encouraging information. And while people in the global development field will often speak about mathematical measures like GDP and rates of growth, Charles gets right to some of the very basic but hugely important developments. Lowering rates of infant mortality by 2/3 in 20 years is astounding. And he looks at the relative accessibility and affordability of things like lighting, sheeting, and clothing in ways that are very eye-opening. As he says, across the globe, we're seeing change that truly can be described as awesome. Getting back to our conversation, I asked Charles to talk about the world's response to COVID-19, and I started by suggesting that another thing we shouldn't take for granted is how rapidly we created and deployed a vaccine.
I agree, although I will say I think the COVID-19 vaccine experience is a sort of a sign of how far we've come and how frustratingly far we still have to go, if you will. From the moment that we understood what the pathogen was, what COVID-19 was, it was a virus with these characteristics, to creating the vaccine against it was the fastest we've ever done it in history by, some fair distance. Usually this is a 5-year or 10-year process, even recently. And of course, for many diseases through history, for a start, it took us ages to figure out what they were. For most of history, we thought that something like cholera was caused by miasma, was caused by smells in the air. We didn't even realize it was a bug, right? So, but even once we figured out that it was a bug, the distance between bug and vaccine against bug was 10, 100 years rather than basically less than one. We then managed to manufacture these vaccines at a scale and a speed that we'd never done before. by some margin. You can compare it to the annual flu vaccine, because that's the only thing we sort of manufactured it close to that scale before. And we did it far faster and far more than we had the annual flu vaccine. And then it spread out worldwide faster than any vaccine previously has done, which is to say, we kind of got to 10% coverage, even in the poorest countries, faster than any other vaccine. A big asterisk on that, a big sort of caveat, is it still took far too long, and people in rich countries who were very low risk were getting access to this vaccine way before high risk people in low income countries. And of course, there's now the sad fact of the matter is that we're kind of peaking demand on vaccines. People don't want the COVID vaccine now and aren't getting vaccinated against it. Some because of kind of ridiculous conspiracy theories about it, being bad for your health, which it's not. But many just because they've already had COVID 3 times and they've got other health worries that they're more concerned with, and that that's sad and is part of the problem. So on the one hand, yes, the world, we're in a better place than ever. On the other hand, we could have done better, right? We could have rolled this vaccine out even faster, even more equitably. And I hope next time we learn the lessons from COVID-19 and do it even better because we have that capacity.
Another thing that folks in this country tend to get down on is where the United States ranks with the rest of the world. And in the upside of down, you talk a lot about that. And one of the things you said that I really liked was, it's not that we're falling behind, the rest of the world is catching up. And that's actually good for us. I think you said what's good for the rest is good for the West. Can you talk about that and how we should sort of reframe that debate? And the other thing I'd add that you said that I was glad to be reminded of, because when I was late college business school, the big threats or the big growing economies were going to be Japan and Great Britain. We're going to join the United States. And all these years later, we're not talking as much about Japan and Great Britain. So anyway, that's a lot in that question. But if you could talk about, what's good for the rest is good for the West and how we should think about that.
Other countries getting richer basically means more people to buy what America makes. But perhaps even more importantly than that, it means more people to create stuff themselves. And in particular, these new technologies we're talking about. China officially is producing more technology than the United States, at least according to one measure, which is patents issued. China is issuing more patents every year than the United States. Frankly, if you look at the quality of those patents, I think the US still actually retains some level of global leadership in technology development. But the fact that China is developing some new technologies that are going to lead to more production, better production of new stuff is really good news. And we know that because the US already benefits from a whole bunch of technologies that China created, including paper and fireworks. Now, July 4th, not the same without Chinese inventions, right? Other places getting rich and creative enough is really good for the United States because we will benefit from some of those creations. I think that the rest of the world getting richer is really good news. Now, there are, again, caveats to that. We've got to worry about the global sustainability of consumption when we will get rich. At the moment, we're producing too many greenhouse gases. And if we continue to produce too many greenhouse gases, that's going to be bad for us all too. But again, creativity helps with that. And actually, if you look at where is producing low-cost solar cells at the moment, it's China. So the fact that places are manufacturing really cheap, zero-carbon technologies is good for the United States. It's good for the rest of the world too. So I really think we need to move away from this sort of zero-sum thinking that if someone else is getting richer, we're getting poorer. And another way to look at that is the United States isn't the richest country in the world, right? It's the biggest economy in the world, at least in market terms. It's the biggest economy in the world. Monaco's far richer. Luxembourg's far richer. I'm not sure, how much that really tells you. I'm sure people in Monaco are very happy. But there's sort of more to life than pure income measures. And it's not about sort of being the largest economy if it's about anything. It's about being the best off economy, and those two things are completely separate. So at the moment, China is the biggest economy according to purchasing power parity. That's when you sort of adjust the size of economies to account for how much things cost within the economies. And because in China it's cheaper to buy a haircut, for example, than it is in the United States, if you adjust for that kind of thing, the Chinese economy looks the biggest in the world in those terms. But on a whole range of measures of the quality of life, China is still somewhere behind us. So even if it's the biggest economy, in some terms, that certainly doesn't make it the place people would rather live. I'd certainly still much rather live in the United States. Thank you very much.
Right. Well, not to mention in terms of technology and patents and creativity, China's still sending a lot of students over here for higher education and those sorts of things. So.
And there's a reason for that. Yeah.
What's good for the rest is good for the West is the subtitle of Charles' book, The Upside of Down. And it's surprising, I think, how hard it is for us in this part of the world to get our heads around this concept. Our sometimes competitive, zero-sum way of thinking isn't very helpful. And Charles argues convincingly that we all benefit when anyone makes progress. I also think he makes an interesting distinction between measuring the richest countries versus the best off, arguing that the latter is what we should all be striving for. And now, back to our conversation. Another thing, though, you've talked about as a benefit to the rest of the world catching up, if you will, is peace and lack of war. And you've said, I think you described it as poverty is the number one threat to peace. And one of the things I think gets lost because terrible things continue to happen around the world, but the trend in terms of active warfare, Steven Pinker's written persuasively about this, I believe you have as well. It's never been more peaceful. The global peace is greater than it's really ever been. Is that a fair characterization?
That's right. I mean, the Ukraine war in Syria. So actually, more peaceful than it's ever been is sadly not true at the moment. At least in terms of global battle deaths. Actually, it was lower in the early 2000s, but it is still, compared to nearly all of history, far lower than ever. The tragedy that is Ukraine and the shock that is Ukraine to the international system, the tragedy that was Syria, Ethiopia. There are still ongoing conflicts that are terrible. But as you say, compared to most of history, just sort of the amount of war going on is far, far less. And one big reason for that is, especially when you look at civil war, where do civil wars happen? Civil wars happen in poor countries. Chris Blackman, who wrote a wonderful book, Why We Fight, civil wars happen in poor countries. With very few exceptions, that's the rule, right? And so the more that the world gets healthier and wealthier, the less we will see that kind of violence. And that's, fantastic news. It probably sadly doesn't mean, the permanent end of war, but it does mean we're in a much better place than we were in terms of the amount of global conflict.
Would you describe the U.S. Civil War that way? I'm thinking about it in the terms you just described. We were obviously a much poorer country back then, but also the threat to the South was economic ruin if the institution of slavery went away. Would you describe the Civil War in the United States as being driven by the threat to economic vitality?
One, I worry about claiming any great historical knowledge of a U.S. Civil War. So let me somewhat dodge the question by saying the reason that civil wars, one of the reasons that civil wars happen more in very poor countries today, is that natural resources, and in particular sort of natural resources in a particular place like a diamond mine, are a much more important part of the total economy. And so sort of fighting over territory really actually kind of makes sense in a way that fighting over territory does not make sense in the United States today, because, add up all the mining revenues together and they don't come to very much. Now, if you go back to the Civil War period for the South, it was an economy far more resource-based than it is today. So that may be a factor, but I don't want to It is always the case that when you look at individual wars, and this is again a point that Chris Plattman makes, in a way, you need a theory that explains why they don't break out a lot. Because most of the time, most places, there isn't warfare going on, even in the world's poorest countries, right? So you need a theory as to why one has broken out. Now, basically, the point is that poverty is a factor that makes it much more likely that a war will break out. The specific reasons why any specific war breaks out have got a lot to do with culture and politics and so on at the time. And so, that's kind of where I would leave that.
Yes. Good answer. Another thing you've written about, and there's a lot of literature these days on happiness and gross domestic happiness and measures like that. And you wrote, I think I'm quoting you here, the proportion of populations in surveyed countries who say they are happy has been rising over time in economies that have seen rapid growth, as well as in economies that haven't. And a great line here, smile, and more of the world than ever before will smile with you. Can you talk a bit about that?
Again, these survey questions where people are sort of asked something along the lines of, on a scale of 1 to 10, do you consider yourself miserable or, being 0 or very happy being 10? They come with a lot of caveats, but they do seem to match up with sort of, if you survey one person and then you ask their friends, what answer do you think they give? They kind of match up. How often people smile seems to be connected with it. Levels of serotonin in the bloodstream seem to be somewhat connected. So I think they do capture something, right? Even if they're not a perfect measure of feelings of well-being. It does seem the trend has been for rising global happiness, again, sort of somewhat independent of income. The latest global happiness survey that just came out, there is a suggestion that it did dip in COVID-19, but not as much as you might have expected, given, all of the miseries of the last few years. I think humans are quite sort of resilient to unfortunate circumstances in that way. So we do seem to have been on this somewhat upward trend on that measure, and you kind of hope so, right? I mean, given that all of these other measures are improving, if global health, COVID-19 aside, if global health is improving everywhere, if we're seeing somewhat rising incomes, but also rising access to infrastructure, better housing, all this other stuff, if none of that was improving levels of happiness, it would actually make you wonder about the happiness measures rather than the progress.
It's interesting to hear Charles' take on the relationship between poverty and war, in particular civil wars. And in thinking about how much more peaceful the world has become, it makes the current conflict in Ukraine look that much more like a terrible and sad outlier. I'm encouraged by what Charles says about rising global happiness. As our discourse in this country seems more often than not to be angry and divisive, I think we all do well to let it sink in that the world at large is becoming a happier place. I next wanted Charles to talk about his thoughts on overpopulation and the interesting research and writing he's done on the work of the famous English economist, Thomas Malthus. Another thing we worried about when I was in college and business school, in addition to the rise of Japan economically, was overpopulation. And you've written very persuasively about the Malthusian trap and whether or not Malthus predicted accurately. And I'd love for you to talk about that because the world population has grown rapidly. There have been fears it contributes to climate change issues, more emissions, more people, more consumption. Can you talk about why you think we should be less worried about overpopulation than we've been in the past?
So Malthus's essay, which, by the way, is a fantastic read, was written in response to two authors, one of whom was Nicolas Caratat, the Marquis de Condorcet, who was a French Enlightenment thinker, who, while he was on the run from the French Revolution and the Terror, in hiding, he wrote this book saying, basically, human progress is going to continue forever. Remarkably optimistic. He ended up poisoned in a Paris prison cell only a few months later. But anyway, despite the fact he was wrong about his own life, perhaps, his predictions for sort of what we're going to happen over the next 200 years was we're going to because of sort of the spread of knowledge, we're going to see more democracy than ever before. We're going to see the end of colonization. We're going to see rising health. We're going to see rising education. The world is going to be a better place. And Malthus wrote this book in response to Condorcet saying, rubbish. It's all going to be grim forever. And it's all going to be grim forever because immediately humans get any better off. What they do is they breed more. They produce more kids. Those kids need to be fed, so on and so forth. There's only a limited amount of land. So if there's only a limited amount of land, you have more kids on it, more people on it. They're going to see their incomes, their livelihoods worsen, and we'll sort of drop back to the standard of living we saw before. It's going to be misery from here on out. Malthus wrote this rather snarky attack on Condorcet. Malthus is the one who turned out to have got the next 200 years of history completely wrong, right? We have seen hugely rising global human populations at the same time as we have seen unprecedented progress in global life expectancy, in global incomes, and so on and so forth. And that's not just true sort of at the global level, it's also true at the country level. There just isn't, Malthus's story is incomes go up, populations go up, incomes go back down again. That story just pretty much is true nowhere. There are a few countries in Africa where maybe you can marginally say the evidence is against that view of history, but very few.
What did he miss, Charles? Was it the impact of technology? Because it seems to me with things like improving fertilizers and the other technologies you've mentioned that could, is that what he missed? What was missing in the analysis?
That was part of it. I think the rate of technology change would have taken him completely by surprise. He actually interestingly wrote just as Jenner invented the smallpox vaccine. And in a later version of his book, he kind of adds an appendix saying, smallpox vaccine, great, wonderful, a few more kids survive, but I've got nothing against that. But of course, it'll make no difference to the quality of life, because it just means there'll be more kids. Back to his story, right? So he started seeing these revolutionary technologies emerge and would not change his story. That's part of it. The other part of it is partially about sort of his ethics or his moral views. He was a parson in the Anglican Church of Britain, and at the time, parsons in the Anglican Church were very strongly opposed to any form of birth control. And so he thought there was sort of no moral way to reduce the amount of babies you get from a given amount of sex. Maybe if the world still agreed with him, we would be in a different place. As it turns out, the combination of more education and lower child mortality has a massive impact on how many kids the average person wants to have, the average woman in particular wants to have. The more likely kids are to survive, the more you think that education is important to your children, the fewer children you yourself want to have. That's true of sort of how many men want to have and how many children that women want to have and have. Right? So now, part of the way that happens is the global spread of contraception. Right? And Malthus would go, ew. But if you don't have a problem with contraception, you go, yay. So we are actually, we're reaching towards peak population because people are choosing to have fewer children. Indeed, my worry right now is not about too many people, it's too few. If you look at the United States, you look at other rich countries, they're way below replacement fertility levels. And I actually think declining populations is what we should be more concerned about than rising populations. But anyway, so he missed two things. He missed the fact that technology was going to allow, even in periods of fast population growth, improvements in the quality of life. And he missed or sort of couldn't deal with the fact that we were going to enter a period where rising incomes did not lead to more babies, but led to fewer babies.
It's interesting, Charles, because there's a juncture here, I think, in the importance of an optimistic mindset in influencing behavior. Because my children are in their 20s, and they have several friends who will say that they don't want to have children, which is obviously a personal choice. But often the reason is because the world is in such bad shape and going to get that much worse. And that, we might have 30 years of good years on this planet before climate change, and another child's only going to make it worse. And so, and if you're concerned about lowering birth rates, these things start to come together. If your mindset isn't aligned with what you're describing, Charles, then it could actually exacerbate the problem, not help.
Absolutely. Sorry, and two things. One, I didn't answer the second half of your question, I realize. Consumption is a real issue. Global consumption is a real issue. Especially if the world all gets as rich as the United States and does so consuming the way the United States does today, we will be consuming in a way that will be really terrible for the planet and for our long-term quality of life. That's not going to happen. We are already seeing decoupling, which is continued economic growth, continued progress on other quality of life metrics without increases in greenhouse gas emissions. And that's because we've invented a whole load of new technologies that allow you to, have the same amount of energy with less carbon cost and so on. And what we need in order to make sure that continues is continued technological progress. What that requires is larger, more educated populations. And so I think we really need to be focusing on that. People aren't the problem. People are the solution. Way too much consumption that is not sustainable, that's a problem. But it's not the people, it's the way too much unsustainable consumption. We really need to sort of focus our efforts on reducing the unsustainable consumption, not reducing the number of people. It really depresses me when I hear people say things like, I don't want to have kids because their life won't be worth living. And it depresses me for two reasons. One is that kind of language has been around for a long time. It's usually been directed at people further away from potential kids. It's usually been, I don't believe the life of somebody in India is worth living because they're close to starvation and so on and so forth. So we ought to impose population control on them, which I think is sort of morally repulsive and wrong. And you could go out and you could survey people in India and ask them if they're happy to be there, and their answer is largely yes. So don't take away their authority to say whether they are happy to be there or not. They are. But when it comes to sort of having kids or not having kids yourself, this generation growing up is the greatest generation ever on a whole bunch of measures. Right? It is the most healthy. It is the most educated. If you look at its beliefs and tolerances, they're the most tolerant generation ever. For all, I know that they can complain too much about the way people speak and stuff, but by and large, they are the most tolerant generation. Right? This generation is going to achieve things that we cannot even dream of. I think they are going to solve the climate crisis to the extent we leave it for them to solve, amongst many other achievements. Right? So to say you don't want to add to that greatest generation, I think is sort of a loss for you, because being a parent is, for all its frustrations, a fantastic thing. And it's a loss for the planet because, your kid could grow up to be the next Einstein, to be, or just, forget being the next Einstein, could grow up to be a really good parent of their own, to be a loving sibling, to be somebody who makes friends' lives better. And you're sort of denying the existence of that person on the grounds of fears that, frankly, I think are irrational.
I really appreciated what Charles had to say here about the generation growing up today. I'm now at what I sometimes consider the, hey, you kids, get off my lawn age. And to hear what Charles says about younger people across the globe is really helpful. They are, he says, the greatest generation on a bunch of important objective measures. They're the healthiest, the most well-educated, most tolerant that the world has ever seen. And it's inspiring to hear Charles consider the incredible changes and improvements he expects them to go out and create. Next, I wanted Charles to drill down a little more on his thoughts regarding education. You mentioned a few times there education, and you had a line in one of your books where you said, you talk about valuing the ABCs and getting shots for DPT. We've talked about vaccines. Can you talk about education worldwide, the rates of education, rates of literacy, and how much that's improved?
Again, we've gone from a world within, just a few decades, we've gone from a world where the majority of people couldn't read and write a simple sentence to one where the great majority can. There are real problems with the quality of education in many developing countries in particular. So kids sitting in school for 5 or 6 years and coming out being able to do not much more than read a rather simple sentence. And so we do need to work on policy. but more than ever before, kids are sitting in school getting an education. It's gone from a rarity to even in the lowest income countries, sort of 9 out of 10 kids being in school, at least through primary school. And university education worldwide, I think we're at 40 some odd % of university age kids are in college of some description. Just massive changes worldwide in terms of access to education and the number of people going through it, and the potential that that suggests is just awesome. The number of people who could plausibly contribute to innovation and creativity is at a huge high, more than it's ever been before, because you've got to sort of multiply the number times the percentage getting that kind of education, and both the number is bigger and the percentage getting that kind of education is bigger. So put the two together, you get just awesomely more people who can be part of innovation and creativity than ever before in history, and it's fantastic.
And it seems to me it's exposing people to more ideas, and you mentioned this generation being more tolerant. I mean, the growth in gender equality, and you mentioned there's still issues in plenty of parts of the world with human rights, but the global trend is extremely positive.
Yes, again, the last sort of 10, 15 years have been grim, although it's a bit hard to tell why. You can imagine it's hard to come up with completely objective measures of human rights worldwide. A score on 1 to 10 of human rights in a country, or of electoral integrity worldwide. And there is some indication that the reason that we've seen flatlining in some of these measures of political freedom worldwide, some of it may be that most of the people who do the coding, who decide this country is a 9 or a 10, are US based, and US researchers are really depressed about the state of democracy.
Yes, right. They go at it with a bad attitude. Yeah.
Leave that aside, the long-term trend is definitely very positive. And as you suggest, the youngest generation in nearly every country worldwide has more liberal attitudes, is more tolerant than their parents were. And it does give me immense hope.
One of the things that struck me, Charles, I'm just going to run this by you. When I read your work, is you talk a lot about the United States or countries in the West and how they view the rest of the world. And it seemed to me that a lot of what you write about could apply to individuals as well. So, for example, instead of measuring ourselves by our total wealth, measuring by our total well-being and happiness, and also instead of resenting or being jealous of people who are gaining or doing better, we should realize that it's all good for everybody. Is that a fair connection? And is it good enough to ever get me in a think tank, or does it fall far short?
I think it is broadly fair. I think one of the interesting things about the subjective well-being literature is it's kind of taught us a whole bunch of stuff that we already knew. Right? So if you go back to some of the earliest sort of ideas about what happiness was about, Aristotle, all the way back to the ancient Greeks, they largely talk about a life well lived, right? They talk about a life where you do something meaningful with your time that helps the broader community. And that's pretty much what comes out of the subjective well-being stuff. If you're in a job that is fulfilling because you are helping others, you are happy. Now, which causes which? Maybe both cause each other. Who knows? But sort of thinking beyond yourself and not thinking selfishly does seem to be a really important part of quality life. And people who think that their happiness, it depends a lot more on income. So think that income is a really important part of their well-being, tend to be less happy. I'm with you. I think the subjective well-being literature does point in that direction. Probably easier said than done from the point of view of acting on it, but still true.
Let's talk a little bit about democracy, the rise of democracies, the more pervasiveness of democracies, but at the same time here in the U.S., and as we record this, some concerns about things happening in Israel and other parts of the world where it feels like autocrats, if you will, are gaining ascendancy, nationalism. Can you talk about the general trends, and then do you have concerns about where we are now, or is this a blip that will, inevitably the tide will continue to move towards full democracies, or what are your thoughts on that?
I certainly hope it's a blip. I think the sort of long-term historical record suggests it's probably a blip. But of course, the long-term historical record didn't just happen. It's a result of what we do about it, right? And so I think it's really important to be an impatient optimist, is the way that Bill Gates put it. I don't know how you want to put it, but optimism is not a grounds for resting on our laurels, nor is all this progress a grounds for resting on our laurels. In some ways, it's quite the opposite. The fact that we can make the world better is a moral imperative to make it better. For most of human history, it was quite reasonable to wake up in the morning and go, the world is always going to be the way the world has always been in terms of basic quality of life, right? It is no longer possible to say that. We have to accept the fact that we have the power to make this world a better place. And if we accept that we have the power to make this world a better place, we kind of really ought to do it. And so I think that, is it a blip? What's going on in Israel? I hope so. Is it a blip? What we've seen in the United States over the last 10 years? I certainly hope so. Brazil is a slightly positive example. India perhaps less so. Certainly, a lot of big countries are not trending in the right direction right now as much as we would like. I think the answers largely lie with them, not us. But I hope that young people in Brazil and India in particular, and in Russia, are brave enough to sort of fight for improved democratic rights. And I hope that young people in the United States continue to believe in the value of democracy and the freedom of speech and so on, and liberties, and fight to make them better. I think they probably will. That's where my optimism comes from. But if they don't, my optimism will be misplaced.
It's a great way to end, Charles. You are as inspiring as you are in print. You're even more so in speaking with you. And I really appreciate it. You have really described a lot of what I'm trying to accomplish here with the work we're doing at the Optimism Institute. And one of the reviews for one of your books said that Charles Kenny is the real deal, an optimist with an economist data to back him up. So when he looks at the glass and sees it's half full, you can rest assured it's not because he needs new contacts.
Although actually I do. But anyway.
But you've really laid it out beautifully for us today. And I can't thank you enough for your time and all the great work you've done. And if anyone out there hasn't read your books, I encourage them to do so because they're full of incredible information that's really inspiring. And I thank you for your work.
Oh, well, thanks very much for having me on, and good luck with the Optimism Institute.
Thanks, Charles. Once again, I love hearing the enthusiasm in Charles' voice when he talks about how improving rates of education around the world, multiplied by a growing population, will equal unprecedented innovation and creativity. And how inspiring were these words? Because we can make the world better, there's a moral imperative to make the world better. Wow. It was at this point in the conversation when I finally waved my internal white flag on the idea of becoming a think tanker. There's a reason why people like Charles Kenny are in there, and people like me are on the outside looking in. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Blue Sky with Charles Kenny. If you did, please consider subscribing to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes. And if you have the time to give us a rating or review, we'd appreciate the feedback. And for more uplifting and inspiring content about the state and future of our world, check out the Optimism Institute on social media. Until next time, I'm the founder of the Optimism Institute and host of Blue Sky, Bill Burke, and I thank you for listening.